Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with the review of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. In accordance with Resolution 5/1, the review is based on the national report, the compilation of UN information, and the summary of stakeholders' information, both prepared by the OHCHR. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bungket Sangsomsak, Minister to the Prime Minister's Office, Chairman of the National Committee on Human Rights of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, to introduce the report. Your Excellency, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for the warm welcome. I met you briefly behind this room. We know you are professional diplomat, and we're going to share the meeting together for the performance of excellent outcome for this meeting. I thank you once again. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegate, I'm greatly honored to lead a high-level Lao delegation to attend this 35th session of the UPR Working Group. On behalf of my delegation, I would like to express my deep thanks for the kind words once again to Mr. President addressed to me for this meeting. I am confident that this meeting under your chairmanship, with the rich experiences and the wisdom, the meeting will be very successful without discrimination, through encouragement and constructive discussion. The LAO PDR participation to this third cycle UPR is not only a national obligation, but also to join hands with the international community on improving of human rights situation. Furthermore, UPR should not be, as my very personal opinion, Mr. Chairman, UPR should not be limited to the role of providing only important recommendations, but also UPR should be the platform, a mandated role that ensure UPR recommendation be complemented to the project implementation supported by the UN and other partners. On this note, UPR has to come to connect human rights with development by ensuring the goal of human rights to be channeled to the objective of development. Mr. Chairman, I think you and me met just a few minutes ago. You don't know my country as I don't know your country. But today I will report to you that my country, my nation, has 6,000 years of existence. But 400 years among them, the Lao people have been denied the basic right, dignity, freedom, liberty, and equality just because we have been under foreign occupation for nearly 400 years. Fortunately, the establishment of the Lao People's Democratic Republic on 2nd December 1995 opened a new era of national independence and ownership of the people of their own country, giving Lao people to be master of the country who have been chosen their own political system, which is the most suitable to the historical, social and cultural reality of the Lao nation, as well as reflects the deep responsive to the political will and aspiration of the Lao people. With this establishment of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, the Lao people will become the master of their own destiny, appreciate the ownership right of the new society in the Lao nation, and will enjoy its basic right of freedom, equality, fairness, and state of Laos will ensure the development of the Lao citizen. I am pleased, Mr. Chairman, to notify that over the past 5 years, the LAO PDR continued to enjoy political stability, social order, which is a crucial factor that facilitates the national socio-economic development, maintaining a steadily high economic growth rate with an average of 6.5% per annum. The living condition of the Lao people has been gradually enhanced and improved, leading to the enjoyment in the right. The government is in the process of formulating the 5-year National Social Economic Development Plan for 2020-2025 by integrating indicators from the effort to self-strength while also cooperating with all friendly nations around the world, including international organizations and other stakeholders, to further contribute to the successful implementation of its 5-year National Social Economic Development Plan. And this bringing a nation out of poverty and least developed country status by 2024. Mr. President, the promotion and protection of human rights are also at the heart of the government of Laos. The year 2015, amendment of the Lao Constitution acknowledges, respects, protects, and guarantees the human right and fundamental right of its citizen in accordance with the law. Right, freedom, and obligation of Lao citizens in various fields, including political, economic, social, and cultural fields, are enshrined in the Constitution of the LAO PDR, in line with the human rights treaties that LAO PDR is party to. These principles have been further developed in detail into hundreds of human rights-related documents and regulations to further ensure full enjoyment of those human rights by the people. Mr. President, the LAO PDR National Report for the third cycle of PR was the compilation of the basic information from all relevant sectors of government, mass organizations, legislative organizations, and judicial organizations through consultation process, and included the contribution from the civil society organizations, academic institutions, UN agencies, development partners, and NGO in the LAO PDR. The content and substance reflect the achievement and progress of the successful implementation of 116 recommendations. I underline 116 recommendations that we have supported in our second cycle review, which have been attained satisfactory, visible, and concrete achievement. Since the second cycle of UPR, the Lao government has taken legislative and policy in action to improve the country's good governance, to deepen the reform of judicial system, graduate people from poverty, prepare the country to graduate from underdevelopment, narrow the development gap, ensure social justice, and guarantee the enjoyment to this basic right. It's right of freedom, liberty, equality, and the development of the country by the Lao people. In pursuing foreign policy of openness and international cooperation, the LAO PDR has become a state party to almost all human rights instruments. I underline, Laos has been party on almost International Covenant on Human Rights, exactly 7 out of 9. On this occasion, the LAO PDR has holding bilateral human rights dialogue with Australia, with the EU, European Union, and is working closely with ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. On this note, Mr. Chairman, I would like to highlight that Laos now enjoy with Australia in the European Union very mutual interest, constructive and fruitful high policy level engagement on human rights. Mr. President, I would like now to take this opportunity to highlight some of the achievements in the sector that have had high success rate of implementation as follows. On fulfillment of LAO PDR obligations under human rights treaties, LAO PDR has committed its initial national report on the CRPD in 2016, the initial national report under ICCPR in 2017. Myself, I was in this building to present such a report. The combined 8 and 9 periodic national report under the CEDAW, the combined 6 to 6 periodic national report under CRC, and lastly the initial national report under 2 optional protocol of the CRC. LAO PDR has invited and received visit from the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale of children, prostitution and pornography of children in 2017, and the Special Rapporteur on human rights in extreme poverty in 2019. On this note, Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned to you in our meeting, I extend my formal invitation to you to visit Laos before the next round of UPR in Geneva. I hope you will accept my invitation. On development rule of law, over the past 5 years, the government has continued to implement its legal sector master plan for 2020 that was adopted in 2010 with emphasis on improving the justice sector, governance in public administration toward more transparency, efficiency and productivity, strengthening the prevention and combating the corruption. We all of this will make LAO PDR being the rule of law state by 2020. To further promote and create more facilitating conditions for the people who have better and wider access to justice, in 2017, the government has adopted the decree on legal aid and the decree on legal aid fund for the disadvantaged people. Up to now, Mr. President, there are 15 legal aid offices across the country which has significantly increased access to justice. You see, the number is only 15. For those big country, 15 is a quite small number. But for Laos, with only 6 million people, 16 office is very big number to other country. Mr. President, on civil and political rights, right to freedom and religion. The Constitution of LAO PDR guarantees the right and freedom of citizens to believe or not to believe in religion. We have amended the Decree number 92 on management and protection on religion activities and adopted the Decree number 315 in 2026 with the aim to better facilitating the lawful religious activities of Lao citizens. Now on right to freedom of expression in peaceful assembly. LAO PDR has open and supportive policy for all people to express their opinion in peaceful assembly, to conduct researches and publications that are not contrary to the law. These rights are guaranteed in the Constitution and further professional in detail through the law adopted by the Assembly. For instance, the law on mass media in 2017, which stipulated that Lao citizens had the freedom to express their opinion through mass media platform in creative manner or other media, and had the freedom to access online social media. In present days, Mr. Chairman, Lao citizens has better and wider access to internet, to social media, with many beneficial uses. At the same time, the government also pay attention for restricting the abuses of online social media to spread fake news, disinformation, and pornography material, among others, that have led to social confusion and degradation. On the right of freedom of association, the LAO government considers the non-profit association and foundation as well as international non-governmental organizations as important partner for social economic development and poverty alleviation. Thus, the LAO government has adopted a number of legal measures. For instance, the Decree on Association and Foundation number 238 created a handbook on the work of association, pamphlet on how to establish and register an association foundation in friendly format. At the moment, there are 163 associations. I repeat, there are 163 associations and 25 foundations that has been approved by relevant authority. For those who are not been in Laos, 160 look very small number. But I told you, Laos is a small country with 6 million people. 163 associations means a great deal for Laos as a country. The LAO government expressed concern relating to the disappearance of the Lao citizen. With regard to the 4 recommendations accepted by the LAO PDR from PDR second, UPR second, concerning the disappearance case, the government of LAO PDR assured that it has not ceased its effort to continue the ongoing investigation to bring the case to the conclusion according to the law and as requested by the family. However, many questions remain unclear. The established investigation committee is continuing to look into all aspects that may deliver further clarity to the cause of disappearance. On anti-trafficking in person, LAO PDR considers human trafficking as violation of the most fundamental right of its citizens. It is a very critical offense as provided for by the law in the law on anti-human trafficking Act 2016. In the Penal Code of 2017, the LAO government actively focused on combating and suppressing human trafficking as well as victim rescue effort. It has also bilaterally cooperated with its neighbor country while also cooperated multilaterally at sub-regional, regional level and with international organizations on combating and suppressing human trafficking, which include preventive measures and victim assistance. Mr. President, now I turn to economic and social cultural rights. LAO PDR considers poverty reduction as one top priority in socio-economic development for aim at graduating from the LDC status by 2034 in achieving the SDG in order to steadily improve the livelihood of its people. The government has adopted in 2030 a vision, Strategic Rural Development and Poverty Eradication Plan 2016-2025. In the last one, the Strategic Development Plan for 2030, National Green Growth Strategy for 2030, and incorporated them into the 8 5-year National Socio-Economic Development Plan, with a view to elevating the LAO people to the middle-income country. According to UNTAC assessment, it is highly probable that the LAO PDR will be able to graduate from LDC by 2024. The LAO PDR considers education as another priority in its socio-economic and cultural development. It has adopted and amended many legislation relating to education sector, such as Law on Education 2015, Decree on High Level of Education 2015, Decree on Monastery Education in 2017. The LAO PDR is implementing its education and sport development plan for 2016-2020 and Vision on Education 2030, as the government has tried to allocate, Mr. Chairman, 17% of its GDP into education sector annually. Since the second cycle of UPR, the government has continued to reform the public health sector in order to provide Lao multi-ethnic people with wide and accessible health care coverage through its bill care policy. The implementation of the Health Reform Plan 2016-2020 is ongoing, as well as the National Nutrition Strategy for 2015 and the National Nutrition Plan 2016-2020. At the same time, the government has focused on improving the infrastructure and expanding in public health network in urban and rural area. The LAO PDR reiterates that land. I emphasize again, the LAO PDR reiterates that land is national treasure under ownership of the all Lao multi-ethnic people, with the state administer the land on behalf of the people in a collective and uniform manner. The state upholds its target of sustainable land use with 70% forest fund. Actually, it should be 73%. 90% agricultural land, of which no more than 2 million hectares is allowed for rice paddy field. And the rest of 11% from the total land is for housing and for other use of land. The state acknowledges and protects the right to land ownership for irrigated land and has adopted a decree 84/PM on land compensation in the settlement of people affected by development project 2016 and to provide fair compensation on land displacement. So, Mr. President, in 2018, provide fair compensation in land displacement. Again, in 2018, the National Assembly adopted a law on settlement and sustainable job allocation, and then in 2019, it has also adopted the law of land. On protection specific group, the promotion of gender equality and elimination of discrimination against women, it considered to have made much progress. Both Lao women and men have equal rights in the political, economic, social, cultural, and family affairs as provided for the Constitution. The National Assembly has adopted the law on gender equality in 2019. The LAO PDR attaches importance to the protection of the right in the best interest of children, reflecting its policy, one-child development, legislative measure, a national mechanism for protection of the right of the child right and interest. It has created a national work plan for protection against and elimination of violence against women and children, National Action Plan for Mothers and Child, National Action Plan for elimination of all privilege and other things for women. Mr. Chairman, despite Laos has made endeavor and progress in the area of promoting and protecting the right of person with disability, LAO PDR ratified to the Convention on the Right of Person with Disability on 25 September 2009. In 2019, it has adopted a law on persons with disability in 2019 and strengthened protection of rights in the interest of persons with disability. Eliminate all forms of discrimination against persons with disability, providing them with enabling conditions for self-development, salaries, and access to social activities. LAO PDR is composed of 50 ethnic groups. I repeat, Laos is composed of 50 ethnic groups living together in peace and harmony across the country. All ethnic groups are equal before the law, and all ethnic groups have duty in contributing toward national safeguarding and development. In law and in practice, LAO PDR prohibits all act or racial discrimination and ethnic division or discrimination. Despite the significant achievement made, there remain many challenges and difficulties in certain areas. So I would like to brief to you, Mr. President, our difficulties. In strengthening the rule of law, there is the need for promoting a better understanding of the law among the law enforcement officers, government officials, judicial officials, and the general public, so that all the society be able to implement the law effectively and fully ensure social justice. Addressing the lack of sufficient resources for further in socio-economic development to achieve LDC graduation target and further promote the full enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights by the LAO ethnic people. The third difficulty is addressing the impact UXO in the war remaining a high hinder and obstruct the national socio-economic development and negatively impact the livelihood of the people in the remote area who have been suffering loss in life, well-being, and property, and having many them with disability. Mr. President, as you know, we still have annual victims from GXO. Before it was 400 to 500 victims, women and children, but now reduced to some hundred. But we would like to hear from distinguished organizations like this, a word, a voice, or sympathy, or encouragement, because they are victims of human rights violation. But we keep quiet on this. So please give us some encouragement to help these children, these women, victims of the XO. I will be very grateful to our distinguished delegate here to come one day to assist Laos to get out from this killing innocent people. Mr. President, I have highlighted some of the achievements of the Lao people, Laos People Republic has made over the past 5 years in implementation of recommendation accepted by second cycle of UPR. It has mastered all of strength and available resources in national endeavor, with assistance and cooperation of international community. At the same time, I have been faced with a similar challenge and difficulty in this endeavor. Therefore, I sincerely hope that from the third cycle review, we will receive constructive, objective, appropriate and sincere recommendation from fellow UN members to allow us to overcome the challenge and progress further in national development and promotion and protection of human rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, as the head of the delegation, I would like once again to express my deep appreciation and thank to you as you chair this meeting. And we are ready as LAO delegation to respond any question, any inquiry, anything that our distinguished delegation Excellency would like to answer from the floor, and we are respond you with open heart. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you, His Excellency, Mr. Bungket Sang Somsak, for this statement. We shall now begin our interactive dialogue. Before giving the floor to the delegations for their questions and comments, I would like to remind you that the speaking time will be 1 minute 15 seconds for all. Please be reminded that the use of the words recommend or recommendation will ensure that the relevant parts of your statements are included in the recommendations section of the working group report. I will now refer to the list of speakers. First on my list is Cuba. Cuba, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation from LAO PDR and thank them for the presentation of a wide-ranging national report. We highlight the commitment to the mechanism, efforts deployed to implement recommendations accepted during the prior review, particularly progress made in the area of education, health and relieving poverty. We recommend the following. 1. To continue adopting tangible actions to eliminate poverty and improve the living standards of your people. 2. Strengthen measures to improve the quality and the range of your education system, particularly in the remote areas. 3. To continue implementing policies to improve access and the quality of public health services, emphasizing reducing child mortality and working in the rural areas. And we'd very much like to wish you every success in your review.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus welcomes the participation of the delegation from the LAO People's Democratic Republic at today's UPR, as well as the presentation of its report. Cyprus notes the progress made by Laos since its last review, including the adoption of the Strategic Development Plan for 2016-2025, the integration of the SDGs into the country's planning framework, as well as a reduction in illiteracy. Cyprus would like to recommend, firstly, ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR and the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. Second, issue a standing invitation to all special procedures of the Human Rights Council. Third, ensure the right to freedom of expression. Fourth, take steps with a view of prohibiting early and forced marriage. And lastly, take immediate actions to criminalize the sexual exploitation, abuse and sale of children. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Czech Republic welcomes the delegation of LAO People's Democratic Republic. The Czech Republic feels encouraged by a series of steps undertaken by the government that improve the legal framework related to children's rights and youth, including the adoption of the National Strategy for Mothers and Children. We applaud the government for measures taken to improve the access to education as well as the enrollment rates among girls. We also note with appreciation that the Lao government reduced the scope of offenses punishable by death penalty from 18 to 12. We would like to offer following recommendations. First, maintain the moratorium on executions and abolish the death penalty. 2. Ensure full enjoyment of the freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly, and progress to fully investigate all allegations of arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, and criminal convictions for expression of political opposition or criticism of state policies. 3. Take effective measures to safeguard the independence and impartiality of the judiciary. And 4. Take steps against trafficking in persons and related labor and sexual exploitation, with special emphasis on child victims, women, and members of ethnic minorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The DPRK delegation warmly welcomed the high-level delegation of LAO PDR and notes with appreciation for its third national report and national information. We highly commend the Lao government for its strong efforts and tangible progress in promotion and protection of human rights through the adoption and implementation of a 10-year strategic development plan for 2016-2025. My delegation wishes the Lao government great success in future endeavor for the promotion and protection of human rights of its people and recommend the following. 1. To accelerate efforts to achieve economic growth aimed to raising the living standard of all people, including those living in remote areas. 2. To continue its efforts to create favorable conditions for ensuring access to free and quality education for all children. 3. To continue its efforts to improve the implementation of its policies on public health and develop the healthcare infrastructure in remote areas. We wish LAO PDR successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Denmark.
Mr. Vice President, Denmark welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic and thanks it for its presentation here today. We commend progress made by LAO PDR in strengthening the legal and policy framework related to children's rights. However, significant challenges remain. Denmark recommends the government to adopt legislative measures to ensure that all forms of sexual abuse, exploitation and sale of children are prohibited and criminalized. The protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all is at the heart of the 2030 agenda and is indispensable in the pursuit of sustainable development. Denmark recommends the government to guarantee the peaceful exercise of the right to freedom and expression by revisiting relevant legislation, including Article 65 of the Criminal Code. Finally, Denmark recommends the government to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. Denmark wishes LAO PDR a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Dominican Republic.
Thank you, Vice President. The Dominican Republic would like to welcome the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR. We recommend respectfully the following. First, that you continue to consolidate national mechanisms that enable greater participation and equality for women, as well as promoting and protecting the rights and well-being of women and girls. Two, that you continue to implement measures and programs to improve prison conditions and guarantee the rights of those persons deprived of their freedom. Three, that you continue to strengthen actions to implement and monitor those recommendations accepted in the UPR, and also to establish a mechanism to link this up to Agenda 2030. And finally, the Dominican Republic welcomes the approval of those laws which are aimed to facilitating, as far as they can, the approval processes for registration as well as the activities of NGOs. And we would like to wish LAO PDR a very successful UPR. Many thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker is Croatia.
Mr. Vice President, Croatia welcomes the delegation of Laos and wishes to thank them for the presentation of their report. We commend the progress made regarding the harmonization of the national legislation in line with international standards and positive steps taken towards establishing a rule of law. However, more efforts are needed to address the issue of ensuring the enjoyment of equal human rights to all segments of society. Furthermore, we regret to see that incidents of torture continue to be reported, including through severe beatings and electric shocks. Therefore, we have two recommendations. 1. Ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty, and enact legislation abolishing the death penalty for all crimes and in all circumstances. 2. Ratify and implement the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and establish an independent, efficient and well-resourced national preventive mechanism with powers to conduct unimpeded visits to all places of detention. Croatia commends Laos for the progress achieved so far and wishes them a success.
Next speaker is Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Estonia welcomes the delegation of LAO PDR. We commend Laos' commitment to eliminate violence against children and for its actions against gender-based violence. We encourage ensuring that women have access to good quality sexual and reproductive health care services, modern contraceptives and comprehensive sexual education. Estonia recommends Laos to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR, to accede to the Rome Statute of the ICC and the Agreement on the Privileges and Immunities, to legalize abortion in cases of risk to the health of the pregnant woman, rape, incest or severe fetal impairment, and decriminalize abortion in all other cases, to adopt legislative measures to criminalize all forms of sexual abuse, violence, exploitation and sale of children, to reform criminal defamation legislation in conformity with the ICCPR Article 19, to guarantee unhindered and private access to domestic and foreign media information for all, both offline and online. Freedom of expression, including freedom of the media, are necessary components of democratic societies. We encourage Laos to uphold all international human rights standards and to review its laws and regulations that restrict the freedom of expression, in particular Article 65 of the Penal the Media Act of 2008.
Thank you very much.
Number 3.
Next speaker is Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ethiopia welcomes the delegation of Laos to this UPR session and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. Ethiopia congratulates the government of Laos in adopting the 10-year strategic development plan and the Vision 2030 that has an ambitious target of graduating Laos from the LDC status and become a self-reliant and an upper middle income country. In this clear vision, Ethiopia would like to seize this opportunity to wish you all the best and call upon the international community to play its role. We would also like to recognize Laos' significant leap in the field of gender equality, where in 2018 it stood 26 out of 149 countries. Ethiopia notes Laos' submission of 4 periodic reports under ICCPR, CEDAW, CRC and CRPD. Ethiopia wishes to make the following recommendation: to enhance its strategy of mitigating vulnerabilities against prolonged drought and floods through a robust climate resilience scheme. We wish Laos a successful review. I thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Fiji.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Fiji welcomes the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic and congratulates the delegation for the achievements in the implementation of the recommendations from its previous cycle. Fiji offers the following recommendations. 1. Adopt a comprehensive, gender-responsive and disability-inclusive approach to climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, consistent with the UNFCCC and Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, to address the economic, cultural and social impacts and challenges that climate change represents for the full and effective enjoyment of human rights for all. 2. Continue to strengthen national and sub-national resource allocations to develop and maintain an enabling environment for young people, women and men, and those living in remote areas to access quality sexual and reproductive health and family services. And 3. Continue efforts to develop a comprehensive child protection system with specific budget allocation, human resources, and adequate follow-up mechanisms to ensure the full and effective implementation of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. We wish the delegation every success in this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Finland.
Mr. Vice President, Finland thanks the People's Democratic Republic of Laos for its national report. We wish to make the following 2 recommendations. First, Finland recommends LAO PDR to establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. Second, Finland remains concerned on the disappearance of the civil society activist Sombat Somphone and recommends LAO PDR to ensure impartial and independent investigations and prosecution, as well as bring all perpetrators of enforced disappearances to justice. Finland wishes the LAO PDR successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is France.
Thank you, Vice President. I'd like to thank the delegation of Laos for the submission of their report. France has taken note of the efforts made by LAO PDR since the last review. However, the situation regarding human rights is of concern. France would make the following recommendations: that they officially set up a moratorium on the death penalty with a view to abolition of the death penalty and commute capital punishment into imprisonment. 2. Guarantee freedom of peaceful assembly, opinion and expression, as well as freedom of the press, by releasing all people who have been detained simply because they have exercised or defended the exercise of those rights. 3. Reform legislation in order to prohibit forced marriage and put an end to the impunity of perpetrators of violence against women and girls. And finally, ratify the Convention on Protecting Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, which was signed in 2008. We wish every success to LAO PDR during their review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Georgia welcomes and thanks the delegation of the LAO PDR for the presentation of the national report. We positively note the continuing steps by the LAO PDR towards the implementation of the international human rights treaties, and Georgia notes with appreciation the measures taken by the government for the protection of children's rights and the adoption of national strategy and national plans of action in this regard, and encourages the government to proceed with the efforts in this direction. We welcome the LAO PDR's aspirations and steps aimed at reducing poverty and graduating from legacy status by 2024. With this, Georgia recommends to the LAO PDR to intensify efforts to combat human trafficking, especially of women and children, including by enhancing the work of the National Steering Committee on Anti-Human Trafficking, and to implement policies aimed at reducing high rates of child and maternal mortality. We wish the delegation of the LAO PDR a successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Germany.
Mr. Vice President, Germany welcomes the progress Laos has made in implementing international human rights instruments and that Laos has repeatedly hosted UN Special Rapporteurs. Germany remains concerned about ongoing restrictions on freedom of expression, association and assembly. Germany recommends to 1. End the arbitrary arrests of individuals for exercising their right to freedom of opinion and expression, including of those who peacefully criticize the government, speak out about negative impacts of infrastructure or investment projects, or expose instances of corruption. 2. Conclude the process of ratification of the ICPD quickly and investigate all cases of enforced disappearances, including the case of Sombat Somphone and of Laotians abroad, and bring perpetrators to justice. 3. Establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 4. Ensure that the adoption and enforcement of laws, including the Land Law of 2019 and the implementation of policies in land management and use, are consultative, transparent and fully compliant with international human rights laws and standards. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Honduras.
Señor Vice President, the delegation of Honduras would like to welcome the distinguished delegation of Laos and thank them for their report. With a spirit of cooperation and a constructive approach, we would like to respectfully recommend the following. First of all, that you ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 2, that you ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. 3, you ratify the optional protocol to the Convention against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. 4, you ratify ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, dated 1989, and 5, you ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC. We congratulate you for the progress made and the results obtained in implementing those recommendations received in previous UPRs, particularly progress made by strengthening your legal and normative framework as regards the rights of the child. Our state also expresses its satisfaction for the measures adopted to increase access to education, improve literacy rates, as well as the enrollment of women and girls in educational establishments. We restate our support to all your actions in order to implement effectively the recommendations received here and also in previous reviews and cycles. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Iceland welcomes the delegation of LAO People's Democratic Republic. We welcome the national report and the steps outlined therein and hope for the continued implementation. We particularly welcome the recent reduction in the scope of the offences for which the death penalty may be imposed. Iceland makes the following recommendations. 1. Fully abolish the death penalty and to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. 2. To expand and accelerate implementation of existing frameworks in order to reduce the high rates of child marriage in rural areas. 3. To address barriers preventing women and girls to access sexual and reproductive health services as made available by the 2016 guidelines on the prevention of unsafe abortions. 4. Adopt comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation that addresses direct and indirect discrimination and encompasses all the prohibited grounds of discrimination, including sexual orientation and gender identity. I wish Lao all success for its review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is India.
Mr. President, India warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR and thanks the delegation for presenting its national report. We commend the progress made by LAO PDR since its second UPR. While acknowledging the constraints and challenges LAO PDR faces due to its landlocked geography, historical burden of unexplored ordinances, we commend its achievements in meeting most of the SDGs. Particularly noteworthy is the significant reduction in poverty levels. We recommend the following to LAO PDR. Strengthen the national human rights mechanisms in compliance with Paris principles. Continue to reinforce efforts to support inclusive growth and prioritize budgetary allocations in primary education and in the reduction of malnutrition and maternal and infant mortality rates. Consolidate the progress made towards reaching the sustainable development goals and in improvement of the human development indicators. We wish LAO PDR all the very best. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Indonesia.
My delegation welcomes the delegation of LAO PDR headed by His Excellency Bongket Sam Songsak. We commend the progress made by LAO PDR since the last review cycle, including in the area of the economic, social and cultural rights. In this context, we emphasize the need for continued international cooperation for LAO to be successful in implementing relevant policy to reduce the poverty gap between urban and rural areas, as well as initiatives on equal opportunity for women. With such encouraging progress, Indonesia recommends the following. First, to continue implement poverty alleviation measures and investment in health and education sector, including by incorporating human rights knowledge in such measure, as well as in the education curricula in order to sensitize and increase nationwide awareness of human rights principle. Second, to further strengthen the capacity of public officials on human rights, including through collaboration with other states. Third, to strengthen efforts to eliminate human trafficking by enhancing awareness-raising campaign for the vulnerable groups in remote area. We wish LAO PDR a successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Iran. Microphone, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My delegations welcome the distinguished delegation of the People's Democratic Republic of Laos and the UPR session and thank them for presenting the national report. We appreciate the Laos efforts to promoting and protecting human rights cooperation in the country and its cooperation with the UPR mechanism. My delegation also commends the Laos government for accepting nearly 16% of the recommendation made to this country, including those provided by my government in the previous UPR period. I would like to make following recommendation to esteemed government of the Laos. 1. To provide protection of the families as the natural unit and the most important foundation of the society in a more effective manner. 2. To enhance the efforts to reduce the rate of the maternal and the child mortality. 3. To make every effort to promote the right to development, which positively affect of the people's rights, in particular in economic and social areas. Finally, we wish the Laos People's Democratic Republic every success during this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of Iraq welcomes the head and members of the delegation of LAO PDR. We welcome also the country's commitment to the presentation of national reports to treaty bodies, as well as to develop national plans to promote rule of law and good governance. We offer the following recommendations. First, accede to the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons against Enforced Disappearances. Second, align national laws with the provision of CRC. We wish the delegation of Laos success in this UPR cycle, and thank you, Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ireland warmly welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. Ireland acknowledges the efforts of LAO PDR to advance human rights domestically and commends the progress made since the last UPR cycle. We welcome the adoption by the government of LAO PDR of the law of the treaties and international agreements in 2017. We encourage LAO PDR to take steps to further strengthen their national human rights framework by establishing an NHRI in line with the Paris principles. Ireland makes the following recommendations. 1. Refrain from initiating criminal proceedings against individuals for the peaceful exercise of their civil rights, including the right to privacy, freedom of expression, association and assembly, having regard to the importance of creating and maintaining a safe and enabling environment for journalists, human rights defenders and other civil society actors. 2. Enact legislation abolishing the death penalty for all crimes and in all circumstances following on from the 2018 revision of the LAO Penal Code, which reduces the scope of offences for which the death penalty may be imposed. We wish the LAO People's Democratic Republic every success with this UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Italy.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Italy welcomes the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR and appreciates its commitment to the UPR and the amendments to the Constitution in order to ensure a better protection of human rights. We also commend the adoption of the law on combating violence against women and children. Italy would like to offer the following recommendations. 1. Introduce a de jure moratorium on capital executions with a view to the complete abolition of the death penalty. 2. Take all necessary measures to put an end to child trafficking, including for the purposes of labor and sexual exploitation, as well as to all harmful practices against women and girls, including child, early and forced marriages. 3. Enhance freedom of expression, lifting restrictions for independent media and providing a safe environment for the work of journalists and human rights defenders. 4. Ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance and initiate full and impartial investigations into allegations of enforced disappearance, torture, and other ill treatment. 5. Strengthen the independence of the judiciary and ensure full and effective access to judicial remedies to vulnerable people and minorities. We wish LAO PDR a successful review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Japan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Vice President. Japan warmly welcomes the delegation of LAO People's Democratic Republic. Japan appreciates the positive steps taken by LAO PDR to implement the UPR second cycle recommendations by adopting new laws and amending existing laws for improving human rights. We further appreciate the submission of 4 national reports to human rights treaty bodies and the acceptance of visits by 2 special rapporteurs. Japan would like to make the 3 recommendations. 1. Take further measures to raise awareness and understanding of human rights in LAO PDR. 2. Continue to increase access to health services and education among women and girls, in particular those living in rural and remote areas. And 3. In addition to considering early ratification of the ICPPED, continue to make efforts for addressing the case of the missing human rights defender. We wish the delegation of LAO PDR every success in the review. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jordan.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد نائب الرئيس يرحب وفد بلادي.
In the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate, we would like to say how much we welcome the participation of the high-level delegation headed by the head of the Commission. Thank you very much for this excellent report, which has been drawn up with stakeholders. We very much welcome the adoption by this country of about 42 new pieces of legislation since 2015. This testifies to their wish to improve human rights situation in the country. You've also adopted national strategies in order to improve the living standards of your multi-ethnic peoples. President, we would like to make the following recommendations: that you continue with your actions in order to cooperate with the international community in order to step up your capacities. Secondly, that you strengthen partnerships with regional international bodies which are responsible for education to ensure education for all and quality education. And finally, we wish every success to LAO PDR at the outcome of this review. Many thanks, Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Kuwait.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation welcomes the delegation of LAO to this UPR session, and we thank it for its presentation and its report and the review. We commend the efforts deployed in the promotion and protection of human rights, as well as the implementation of accepted recommendations in the second UPR cycle. We also applaud steps undertaken by law, which include passing and amending laws, development of national plans, as well as reinforcing cooperation with the international community and international mechanisms in order to protect human rights and promote them. In this light, we would like to recommend to speed up efforts to achieve economic development in order to improve living standards of the people, particularly with regards to the provision of health care to those living in remote areas. In closing, we wish Lao success in this UPR, and thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kyrgyz delegation welcomes the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR and thanks for the presentation of its national report today. We welcome the progress made in strengthening the legislative and policy frameworks in the field of children's rights. We commend the adoption of the National Strategic Plan on Reproductive Health Services for Mothers and Newborns and Child Health Care 2016-2025 and the National Plan of Action for Mothers and Children 2016-2020. In this regard, we would like to recommend the following. First, to extend public health system with a view to provide more basic health services to all and reduce child mortality. And second, to continue creating favorable conditions for ensuring access to free and quality primary and secondary education for all children. In conclusion, my delegation wishes success to Laos in its endeavors in the promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Latvia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Latvia welcomes the delegation of LAO People's Democratic Republic. We note measures taken by the government in the field of promotion and protection of human rights in the previous review. Latvia welcomes information provided on LAO PDR's cooperation with the Human Rights Council Special Procedure Mandate holders. We remain concerned about continued restrictions on the freedom of expression. In this regard, we would like to recommend to the government to ensure the freedom of expression and media freedom by bringing national legislation into line with international standards. Latvia would also like to reiterate following recommendations from the previous cycle. Consider the extension of a standing invitation to all special procedure mandate holders of the Human Rights Council and accede to and fully align national legislation with all the obligations under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Latvia wishes to the delegation of LAO People's Democratic Republic a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Luxembourg.
Thank you, Vice President. Luxembourg would like to thank the LAO PDR for the presentation of its national report. Luxembourg welcomes its well-established bilateral partnership with Laos and commends the socio-economic progress in the country since the last UPR. Luxembourg also encourages the Laotian authorities to ensure that national policies support equitable development across all of the country, placing particular attention on the most vulnerable groups. Luxembourg offers the following 5 recommendations. First, guaranteeing the effective exercising of freedom of expression by reforming legislation on the media, as well as legislation on fighting cybercrime. 2, guaranteeing that the freedom of expression can effectively be exercised, as well as the freedom to meet and to freedom of association, reforming legislation so as not to hinder NGOs and human rights defenders. Third, to improve planning of development and investment projects to prevent forced displacement and improve the movement and provide compensation for confiscated land. Fourth, to work towards the abolition of the death penalty.
Time is up. Next speaker is Malaysia.
Malaysia warmly welcomes the esteemed delegation of LAO PDR. Malaysia lauds LAO PDR for its commitment to develop and improve existing laws and policies to guarantee the rights of its people. As a fellow ASEAN member, Malaysia is appreciative of LAO PDR's contributions to the ASEAN community building and realization of the ASEAN Common Human Rights Agenda. Malaysia commends LAO PDR for implementing the accepted recommendations from its previous UPRs. In the context of the current review, Malaysia offers 3 recommendations which we believe would further complement the undertakings of LAO PDR in promoting its human rights and socio-economic developments. 1. Continue efforts to provide quality education for all. 2. continue its effective measures to improve women's access to health services, in particular reproductive health services, and 3, strengthen regional and international cooperation in the field of human rights. We wish LAO PDR a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Maldives warmly welcomes the high-level delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic to this third cycle review. The Maldives commends the government of LAO PDR for the measures taken to raise awareness on the country's constitution by facilitating the people of Lao easy access to legal information. In constructive spirit, the Maldives presents the following 2 recommendations to LAO PDR. 1. To review the government's economic strategy, taking necessary steps to conserve the environment by developing guidelines to conduct studies on the environmental impacts of foreign investment projects. 2. Establish an independent body to investigate deaths and enforce disappearances of the country and provide this body the investigative powers by law that are necessary to conduct free, independent and reliable investigations. We wish LAO PDR every success at this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Malta.
President, Malta welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. We commend the progress that the state under review has achieved since its second review cycle and the implementation of the recommendations it received. We particularly welcome the state's cooperation with the UN treaty bodies and special procedures, the measures it instituted to improve freedom of expression and association, as well as its efforts aimed at safeguarding rights of women and family protection. In this context, Malta would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Consider abolishing the death penalty for all crimes in all circumstances. 2. Continue taking measures to improve investigations into cases of enforced disappearances. 3. Continue taking steps to improve the rights of LGBTI persons, particularly by identifying their needs, and consider involving LGBTI representatives in decision-making processes. We wish the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic a successful review session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bungkat Sangsomsak and his delegation to address observations and comments that have been raised so far. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you once again for giving the floor. But before giving the floor to my colleagues from Lao delegation, I would like to take this opportunity to express once again, Mr. President, yourself as excellent chairman conducting this meeting under very tight frame according to us. So please accept my appreciation to you. Now I give the floor to the Lao delegation as follows. On freedom expression, Ministry of Information. On independent judiciary, Ministry of High Court. On detention, I give the floor to Ministry of Public Security. On disappearance, it's going to be Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pukong. And on death penalty, Ministry of Justice. So you respond one by one until we complete 6 speakers on the list. So the first speaker now is Ministry of Information. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, with your permission, allow me to provide some additional clarification on the freedom of expression of our citizens, as some concern was raised by some delegation as follows. The LAO PDR reiterates that the rights of freedom of expression of our citizens are guaranteed by the Constitution and relating laws as explained in our national report for this third cycle. Of course, the enjoyment of such rights is subjected to certain boundaries, as Article 19 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights has clearly prescribed that the freedom of expression must take into consideration the specific obligation and accountability. For instance, the freedom and reputation of others, national security, social morale, and public order. These values are protected in the relevant laws of the LAO PDR in line with the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. All violators of the law are subject to legal responsibility before the law. I thank you.
Next speaker from the High Court.
Mr. President, allow me to provide some additional information on the topic of on the independence of the court. We have conducted in accordance with the principles of justice and according to our Constitution, Article 94, and the law on the People's Court that prohibits all parties from interfering the affairs of the court as prescribed in Article 2 of the law on the courts. And during proceedings, we only use the law as the basis for deciding a case, meaning the law only, and the facts of the case are the only references that we use in deciding a court. And the judges are protected by the law against all threats and harms to their properties and well-beings and their families, as prescribed in Article 6 of the law on the People's Court. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Speaker from Public Security.
Mr. Chair, President, I cannot hear the speaker. In general, the Lao government has the sentences given are not for the purpose of punishing the prisoners. So on the realities and the actual capacities, the LAO PDR has emphasized on improving the conditions in the detention centers on a regular basis, aim at improving the living conditions of the prisoners as appropriate. And across the country, there are 18 detention centers, including 2 in the capital, which the government has allocated budgets for improving these detention centers. As reflected up to now, the government used more than $107 million to improve the infrastructure of the prison or detention centers and reduce the crowding in prison. And especially in 2019, we have completed the moving of a prison from the capital into a more spacious area and improve the conditions of the detention, the living conditions of the detainees. And in going forward, in addressing the overcrowding problem, the government of LAO PDR will continue to improve the prison conditions, and we will create regional prisons, and we will further emphasize on our humanitarian policies for the sentenced detainees, such as clothing, visiting, sports activities, handcrafts, and vocational training. And also on the special occasions of the country, the government also has the clemency and pardons policy according to the law. For example, since 2015 to 2018, the numbers of persons who have been granted clemency is 4,864, of whom 1,001 were women. And particularly in 2019, there were 1,042 prisoners being considered for clemency. And in 2018, the President issued clemency and reduced the death penalty to life imprisonment for 32 persons, of whom 2 were women. Thank you.
Next speaker from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pukong.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished delegates, I would like to provide additional clarification on the disappearance case of Sombat Suphon. It has been raised by a number of delegations. As has mentioned by the head of the LAO delegation, the LAO PDR assures that it has not ceased its efforts to continue the ongoing investigation to bring the case into conclusion. And however, many questions remain unclear, and the investigation committee continues to look into all aspects that may be related to the case. The Lao government also reaffirms that the investigation has been conducted in a transparent, fair and just manner. The technical methods which have been employed by the investigation officers are also modern and matching international standards, and all investigation officers have the sufficient capacity that were deemed necessary for conducting their duties. However, the whereabouts and the truth could not still be concluded. While it must be acknowledged that out of the countless disappearance cases in the world, some are unresolved, some take a very long time to resolve, and some are simply cannot be broken through despite all the time and technology allocated. As such, the case of Sombat Suphon, we think, would require more time for the investigation. And I would like to reiterate again the words of the head of the Lao delegation. The government will continue to investigate. It will take all aspects to try to bring the case to the conclusion. Thank you.
The last speaker for this item is death penalty from the Ministry of Justice.
Mr. President, please allow me to further contribute to the issue of the death penalty as follows. Ladies and gentlemen, you have already read the report, and you have already known that LAO PDR have a great achievements on the reduction of the death penalty from 18 articles to 12 articles. This is, for us, it's quite, huge challenging. During discussion and elaboration of the Penal Code 2018, the National Assembly have raised the issue and debate about this abolition of the death penalty. And as a result, the special vote was gone out for this subject. And as a result, it showed that the majority of the members of the National Assembly were of the view that they still need to maintain the death penalty with the new penal code, and reserved exclusively for the most serious crimes. A decision to maintain the death penalty is not violation of the international human rights obligation, especially Article 6 of International Convention on the Civil Rights and Political Rights. I would like further to express that even though we maintain the death penalty in our new penal code, the court still decide on the most lifting sentence for the crimes committed. At the same time, the law also guarantees the impartiality, transparency, and the right of the accused in all trials, including those with the maximum sentence of the death penalty. Furthermore, those have been sentenced with the death penalty can also have the opportunity to file or to request for an appeal, clemency, and pardons. Thank you.
Mr. President, we have exhausted the topic that we have to respond, so I give you back the microphone. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you very much. We will now continue with our interactive dialogue. Next speaker on my list is Mexico. Mexico, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Vice President. We'd like to welcome the delegation of LAO PDR, and we'd like to thank them for the submission of their report. Mexico recognizes the efforts made to incorporate into their national legislation the provisions of international treaties, particularly the criminalization of torture, human trafficking, and reasons for discrimination. And also we'd encourage them to continue strengthening their legal framework. With a view to strengthening efforts to improve human rights, respectfully, we'd recommend the following. 1, that you establish a national human rights institution in line with the Paris Principles. 2, that you adopt legal administrative provisions for the issuance of birth certificates free of charge, as well as establishing civil registration offices in all districts, particularly focusing on the rural areas. 3, take necessary measures to prevent and combat discrimination and persecution against ethnic minorities and religious minorities, guaranteeing their right to freedom of expression and conscience, as well as access to health, education, and an appropriate standard of living. We wish every success to your country during this review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mongolia. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Mongolia is pleased to note that the LAO PDR has worked vigorously to create favorable legal conditions for the full enjoyment of civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights enshrined in its constitution and the international human rights instruments it has acceded to. We further note the strides the LAO government has made in ensuring gender equality, protecting the rights of women, children and persons with disabilities, reducing poverty and improving the country's healthcare and education system. Mongolia commends the LAO PDR on its regular human rights trainings for officials, in particular law enforcement officers from central to local levels and the general public. Such human rights education is absolutely essential. Otherwise, officials would be oblivious to the fact that their primary duty is to protect human rights rather than serve the abstract notion of state. We call on the LAO PDR to step up its efforts to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of all Persons from Enforced Disappearance and the Convention Against Discrimination in Education. And lastly, we call on the LAO PDR to accede to the optional protocol aimed at the abolition of the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Montenegro. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Montenegro welcomes the distinguished delegation of the LAO People's Democratic Republic. We commend all the results that have been achieved in the promotion of human rights. We encourage the national authorities for the further engagement conscious of all objective difficulties, including the economic development, challenges related to rural and remote areas, contaminations with ERW and others. We note with appreciation the adoption of the National Action Plan of the Prevention and Elimination of Violence Against Women and Children. We welcome the significant progress that has been made concerning maternal and infant mortality. We encourage the government to provide equal access for women and men to HIV/AIDS prevention and adequate treatment resources, as well as free access to antiretroviral medicines for women and girls. We express concerns about the lack of the legal framework to define and criminalize all acts of enforced disappearance, the fact that the death penalty still exists, and the reports that victims of human rights violations who have limited education and were poor faced greater barriers in accessing the formal justice system. Montenegro recommends first to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of all Persons from Enforced Disappearance, second, issuing a standing invitation to all special procedures of the Human Rights Council. We wish the UPR cycle.
Time is up. Thank you. Next speaker is Morocco.
Monsieur le Président,
President, my delegation would like to warmly welcome the delegation from the LAO PDR. We thank them for the presentation of their national report under the third cycle of the UPR, which focuses mainly on the application of the 116 recommendations accepted in 2015. My delegation commends the government of Laos for progress achieved in protecting and promoting human rights, notably by the adoption of 42 new laws and the adoption by the National Assembly of a new legal and legislative reform plan for 2015 to 2020. Following also the recommendations of the previous cycle, my delegation hails the LAO PDR for transposing into domestic law provisions from international instruments to which it is a party. My delegation would like to propose the following recommendation: to continue efforts deployed in promoting the rule of law and good governance, notably strengthening the justice sector. Thank you, President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation welcomes the delegation of LAO PDR led by His Excellency Mr. Bongkat Samsonset and thanks them for the comprehensive national report. Myanmar commends the positive and firm measures taken by LAO PDR in implementing the recommendations made during the previous cycle of UPR. As development is one of the key foundations of the developing state, the achievements by the Laos in poverty alleviation and efforts for graduation from LDC status by 2024 are commendable. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Myanmar would like to make the following recommendation. 1. Continue its measures to implement the National Action Plan for Poverty Reduction in order to alleviate poverty and to improve the standards of living. 2. To continue its exerted efforts to empower women for more participation in all levels of decision-making. And 3. Further strengthen measures to ensure sufficient allocation of teachers and improvement of school facility in remote areas. As its close neighboring country and fellow ASEAN member, Myanmar wishes LAO PDR every success in this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Nepal warmly welcomes the delegation of the LAO PDR to the third cycle of UPR process. We appreciate the continued cooperation and engagement of the LAO PDR with the UN human rights mechanisms for the promotion and protection of human rights. We welcome the adoption by the LAO PDR of the 10-year strategic development plan with the vision of graduating from the LDC status by 2024. We commend the efforts of the LAO PDR to promoting gender equality, women empowerment and improving maternal health care services. While wishing the LAO PDR a successful review, we recommend the following. 1. Make efforts to strengthen national human rights institutions in accordance with the Paris Principles. 2. Continue measures towards inclusive socio-economic development through investment in health and education sectors, including in the rural areas. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic for the presentation of its national report. We welcome the commitment of the government of Lao to bring its domestic legislation in line with its obligations under international human rights instruments. The Netherlands remains concerned about the restricted space for civil society in Lao and tight surveillance of activities by non-governmental organizations and government critics, both offline and online. We would like to recall Lao's commitment made during its last UPR to ratify and implement the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. The Netherlands therefore recommends Lao to 1. Ensure the right to freedom of expression by repealing Article 56 of the Penal Code on acts of betrayal towards the nation and Article 65 of the Penal Code on propaganda against the state, in line with the ICCPR and the United Nations Declarations on Human Rights Defenders. 2. To ensure independent and impartial investigations into cases of enforced disappearances and hold perpetrators to account. The Netherlands wishes Lao success with the follow-up of all recommendations it receives during the third UPR cycle. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is New Zealand. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. New Zealand welcomes the participation of Lao People's Democratic Republic in this process. New Zealand notes positively that the death penalty has not been enforced in Lao PDR since 1989 and recommends that Lao PDR considers taking further action towards the abolition of the death penalty. New Zealand recommends that Lao PDR undertakes full independent investigations into all unresolved cases of alleged enforced disappearances, including that of Mr. Sombat Sompon. New Zealand further recommends that Lao PDR reviews and amends legislation and practices relating to freedom of expression and assembly to fully enable the function of non-governmental organizations and civil society. New Zealand commends improvements in the education of girls in Lao PDR and recommends further efforts towards addressing disparities in education. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Nicaragua.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Vice President. The Government of the Republic of Nicaragua extends greetings to the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR. We thank them for the presentation of their UPR, and in a constructive spirit we make the following recommendations. 1. That you continue with your hard work to mainstream the goals and indicators of the SDGs into your national plan. 2. We're happy to see the satisfactory progress you've made in reforming your legal and normative framework regarding the rights of the child, and we urge you to continue those efforts. 3. We also urge you to continue adopting effective measures to combat climate change. The delegation of the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Nicaragua to the United Nations wishes the Laos delegation every success in their UPR. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Norway.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Norway welcomes the LAO PDR's participation in the UPR and notes the positive step to invite the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights to visit the country. Norway recommends the LAO PDR to 1. Create and maintain a safe and enabling environment for human rights defenders and civil society to constructively contribute to policy making and national development. 2. Ensure that all women and girls have access to appropriate sexual and reproductive health services, and implement policies including awareness raising to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls. 3. Ensure that freedom of expression is safeguarded in all its forms. 4. Continue to take concrete action to address disparities in access to education, especially among rural ethnic groups, as a means to combat poverty, early marriage and human trafficking. 5. Develop a national action plan for full implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Pakistan. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Pakistan warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Laos People's Democratic Republic and thanks it for a comprehensive presentation of the national report. Pakistan appreciates Laos' efforts to ensure gender equality and health care, in particular for women and children. We specifically commend Laos for the adoption of a national plan on reproductive health services for mothers, newborns and child health care. Pakistan would like to make the following recommendation to the government of Laos People's Democratic Republic. Number 1, continue to take concrete measures to eliminate poverty and improve living standards for people. Number 2, strengthen measures to further realize the right to education by providing adequate school facilities and teachers in remote areas. And number 3, continue its efforts to improve women in decision-making roles at all levels. We wish the delegation of Laos People's Democratic Republic a very successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Paraguay.
Paraguay extends a warm welcome to the delegation of LAO PDR, and we welcome the presentation of their report. Respectfully, we recommend the following: that you ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights aimed at abolishing the death penalty, and this bearing in mind SDG 16. 2. You ratify ILO Convention 189 on domestic workers in order to make progress in SDG goals 5.4, 8 and 16. 3. That you implement programs and measures to put an end to early pregnancies and forced marriages and early marriages of girls in line with SDG 5, 3 and 5.4. 4. That you request cooperation from the Office to establish a standing permanent national mechanism for the implementation, reporting and follow-up of recommendations in the area of human rights within the framework of SDG 16 and 17. We welcome the efforts made to incorporate into your national legislation the provisions of international treaties to which you are a party. Also, the public policies implemented so far, particularly your National Action Plan for the Prevention and Elimination of Violence Against Women and Children. We also welcome the cooperation shown with treaty bodies.